The grand ballroom of Ravenshaw Manor glittered beneath hundreds of candle flames, each one reflected in the polished crystal of enormous chandeliers. It was the autumn of 1891, and the finest families of Victorian England had gathered beneath the Ravenshaw roof for an evening of music, dancing, and whispered alliances. At the centre of the magnificent room stood Duchess Victoria Ravenshaw, 28 years old, dressed in an elegant deep burgundy silk gown with delicate ivory lace at the neckline. Her chestnut-brown hair was arranged in a graceful Victorian updo, and a small diamond necklace rested against her throat. She possessed the beauty expected of a duchess, but it was her calm manner and kindness toward others that made her unusual among the aristocracy. At her side stood Clara Bennett, 22, Victoria's personal maid. Clara wore a modest dark blue servant's dress with a white collar and a simple white apron. Though she was quiet in public, Victoria knew her to be intelligent, loyal, and remarkably observant. Clara had served the Duchess for several years, and their relationship had grown beyond the formal boundaries of mistress and maid. Victoria had always believed that loyalty was earned through kindness, not demanded through rank. Unfortunately, not everyone at Ravenshaw Manor shared her beliefs. Across the ballroom stood Lady Margaret Blackwood, 55, dressed in a magnificent black velvet gown embroidered with silver thread. Her grey hair was carefully arranged beneath an elaborate jewelled comb, and her sharp eyes seemed to examine every person in the room as though searching for weakness. Lady Margaret had long considered Victoria too soft for her position. She believed a duchess should command fear, not affection. And tonight, she intended to prove it. The evening had been proceeding peacefully until a sudden commotion came from the adjoining gallery. A footman hurried into the ballroom, his face pale. "Your Grace," he said breathlessly, approaching Duke Alexander Ravenshaw, 34, who had been speaking with several gentlemen near the fireplace. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but there has been a serious matter." The music gradually stopped. Alexander's expression hardened. "What happened?" "The Ravenshaw sapphire brooch is missing." A murmur swept through the ballroom. The sapphire brooch was one of the family's most treasured possessions, an heirloom that had belonged to the Duchess's great-grandmother. Its enormous blue stone was surrounded by diamonds and was said to be worth a fortune. Alexander immediately ordered the gallery sealed. Victoria's heart tightened. "Where was it?" she asked. "In the small display room, Your Grace," the footman replied. "And who was there?" The young man hesitated. Before he could answer, Lady Margaret stepped forward. "I believe I can answer that." Every eye turned toward her. Lady Margaret slowly raised one gloved hand. "I saw Clara Bennett near the gallery shortly before the brooch disappeared." Clara's face immediately lost its colour. Victoria looked at her maid. "Clara." "I was there, Your Grace," Clara admitted softly, "but only because Mrs. Whitby asked me to bring fresh linens to the adjoining room. I never entered the display room." Lady Margaret gave a cold laugh. "How convenient." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Lady Margaret, perhaps we should wait until we have investigated the matter." "Investigated?" Margaret replied. "What investigation is necessary?" The girl was near the room. "The jewel disappeared. Surely even you cannot be blind to the obvious." Clara lowered her eyes. "I did not take it." Lady Margaret stepped closer. "Then prove it." Clara's hands trembled. "I cannot prove something I did not do." The aristocrats began whispering among themselves. Victoria heard fragments. "A servant. Perhaps she needed money. These girls cannot always be trusted." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to cry. Lady Margaret seemed pleased. "Your Grace," she said, turning toward Victoria, "this is your household. Surely you understand the importance of discipline. If servants are allowed to steal from their masters without consequence, what message does that send?" Victoria's expression remained composed. "I understand the importance of evidence." Margaret's smile disappeared. "Then perhaps we should make the matter very simple." She turned toward Clara. "Kneel." The room fell silent. Clara stared at her in disbelief. "My lady." "You heard me. Kneel before the family whose trust you have betrayed." "I have not betrayed anyone." Margaret's voice became colder. "Kneel." Clara looked desperately toward Victoria. For one terrible moment, nobody moved. Then Clara slowly lowered herself. The young maid's knees touched the polished marble floor. A gasp travelled through the room. Victoria's hands tightened around the fabric of her gown. She had watched servants endure insults before. She had seen wealthy people speak cruelly to those beneath them simply because they believed wealth gave them permission. But this was different. Clara was innocent. Victoria knew it. And yet the entire room was allowing humiliation to become a substitute for justice. Lady Margaret looked down at Clara with satisfaction. Now apologise to her Grace and His Grace for bringing shame upon this household. Clara's voice trembled. I am sorry for causing trouble, Your Grace. But I cannot apologise for stealing something I never touched. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Victoria looked carefully around the room. Something was wrong. Clara had been carrying linens at the time of the theft. Victoria remembered seeing her cross the servants' corridor shortly before the musicians began playing. More importantly, the display room had been locked. Only a handful of people possessed keys. Clara did not. Victoria slowly turned toward Lady Margaret. Who opened the display room? Margaret stiffened. The door was unlocked. Was it? Alexander immediately looked toward the footman. Who discovered the room? I did, Your Grace. And was the door locked when you arrived? The footman swallowed. Yes, Your Grace. Silence. Victoria's suspicion deepened. Lady Margaret quickly interrupted. That proves nothing. Someone could have locked it after the theft. Perhaps, Victoria said calmly. But then we must determine who had the key. Margaret's eyes flashed with irritation. This is becoming ridiculous. No, Victoria replied. What is ridiculous is accusing a young woman before determining whether she could even have committed the crime. Every conversation in the ballroom ceased. Victoria walked toward Clara. She stopped beside her maid and extended her hand. Clara, stand. Clara looked up, tears shining in her eyes. My lady. I said stand. Clara took Victoria's hand and rose. Victoria then turned toward the assembled aristocrats. A title does not give any of us the right to humiliate an innocent person. Lady Margaret's face reddened. Are you challenging me? I am challenging an accusation without proof. Alexander stepped beside Victoria. You heard the Duchess, he said firmly. No further punishment will occur until the truth is established. Margaret's expression became dangerously cold. You will regret making this public. Victoria met her gaze without fear. Perhaps. But I would regret remaining silent far more. The Duchess looked around the ballroom. Tonight, someone stole a priceless heirloom. But before we discover who stole it, I believe we have already discovered something equally important. Everyone waited. Victoria glanced at Clara. An innocent woman was nearly condemned simply because she had the least power in this room. Her voice remained gentle, but every word carried authority. I will find the truth. And as the guests watched in stunned silence, Victoria realized that the missing sapphire was not merely a stolen jewel. Someone had deliberately placed Clara in the path of blame. And whoever had done it had made one grave mistake. They had underestimated the Duchess. The ballroom slowly emptied after Duchess Victoria Ravenshaw's declaration, but the tension she had created did not disappear with the guests. Small groups of aristocrats gathered in the corridors, whispering about the missing sapphire, Clara's accusation, and the unexpected defiance of the Duchess. Victoria ignored them. She had only one concern. Clara. In the privacy of her dressing room, Clara stood near the window, her hands clasped tightly before her. Her eyes were still red from the humiliation she had endured. Victoria closed the door behind them. You should not have been made to kneel, she said quietly. Clara lowered her gaze. It was my place to obey, Your Grace. Victoria stepped closer. No, Clara. Your position as my maid does not make you less human. Clara's eyes filled with tears again. You are the first person who has ever said that to me. Victoria gently placed a hand on her shoulder. And I mean every word. A soft knock interrupted them. Duke Alexander Ravenshaw entered the room. He had removed his formal gloves, but his expression remained stern. "The household is being searched," he said. "I have ordered every servant questioned separately." Victoria nodded. "Good." Alexander looked toward Clara. "Do you still maintain that you never entered the display room?" "Yes, Your Grace." "And did you touch the sapphire?" "Never." Alexander studied her face for several seconds before nodding. "I believe you." Clara looked surprised. Victoria smiled faintly. "Then we have three people who believe the same thing." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Three? You, me, and Clara." A faint smile appeared on his face. "Then perhaps we are not entirely without hope." The following morning, Victoria began her own investigation. She did not announce it. She knew that whoever had stolen the sapphire might already suspect that she was looking for them. Instead, she began with the simplest question. Where had Clara been? Victoria summoned Mrs. Whitby, the elderly housekeeper. "You sent Clara to the gallery yesterday evening." "Yes, Your Grace." "For what purpose?" "To collect fresh linens from the cabinet outside the east drawing room." "How long was she gone?" "No more than 10 minutes." "And during that time, who was responsible for the western corridor?" Mrs. Whitby thought carefully. "Thomas Reed, one of the footmen." Victoria immediately asked for Thomas. The young footman arrived looking nervous. Victoria noticed that he kept rubbing his hands together. "You were stationed near the western corridor yesterday?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Did you see Clara?" "Yes." "Where?" "Near the servants' corridor." "Did she enter the display room?" "No, Your Grace." Victoria exchanged a glance with Alexander. "Did anyone else enter that corridor?" Thomas hesitated. Victoria's voice softened. "You will not be punished for telling the truth." Thomas swallowed. "There was someone else." "Who?" "I don't know." "What did you see?" Thomas looked toward the door before answering. "A man." Alexander stepped forward. "What man?" "I could not see his face. He wore a dark coat and gloves. He came from the direction of the display room." Victoria's pulse quickened. "What time?" "Just before the musicians began their second song." "And Clara?" "She was already walking toward the east drawing room." That single statement destroyed Lady Margaret's accusation. But Victoria was not satisfied. "Why did you not mention this last night?" Thomas looked ashamed. "I was afraid." "Of whom?" He remained silent. Alexander's expression hardened. "Thomas." The footman finally whispered, "Lady Margaret's secretary spoke to me before the guests arrived. He told me that if anything happened to the family jewel, I should keep quiet." The room became silent. Victoria looked at Alexander. A larger conspiracy was beginning to reveal itself. That afternoon, Victoria examined the display room herself. The sapphire's empty case sat inside a glass cabinet. There was no sign of forced entry. The lock had not been damaged. Alexander examined the cabinet. "Who has a key?" "Your father had one," Victoria said. "You have one." "I have one. And the master key is kept by Mrs. Whitby." Alexander frowned. "Lady Margaret shouldn't have one." Victoria's eyes moved toward the cabinet. "Shouldn't she?" Alexander looked at her. "You suspect her?" "I suspect everyone who benefits from Clara's downfall." He was silent for a moment. "Then what do you think her motive is?" Victoria's expression became serious. "She doesn't merely want Clara punished." "What do you mean?" "Think about it. Why accuse my maid publicly? Why humiliate her before half the county? Why insist upon punishment before an investigation?" Alexander's face changed. "She wants to damage your reputation." "Yes." "But why?" Victoria walked toward the window. "Because my reputation is connected to the future of this estate." Alexander understood immediately. "The inheritance." Victoria nodded. Several months earlier, Alexander's late father's will had been challenged by distant relatives. The estate would remain firmly under the Ravenshaw family only if the household's legal and financial affairs remained stable. A scandal involving Victoria could provide Margaret and her allies with an opportunity to question her ability to manage the estate. Alexander clenched his jaw. She planned this. Perhaps, Victoria said. But we need proof. That evening, Victoria returned to the servants' quarters. She found Clara sorting linens. You should be resting, Victoria said. Clara smiled sadly. I find work easier than thinking. Victoria sat beside her. I need to ask you something. Anything. Did anyone speak to you yesterday before the gathering? Clara thought carefully. There was one person. Who? Lady Margaret's secretary. Victoria's expression sharpened. What did he say? He asked whether I had access to the display room. And what did you tell him? That I did not. Clara hesitated. He seemed disappointed. Victoria stood. Did he touch anything? Clara nodded slowly. He gave me a tray of refreshments and told me to take it to the gallery. But Mrs. Whitby called me away before I could deliver it. Victoria and Alexander exchanged a look. A tray, Alexander said. Victoria's eyes widened. Then the secretary could have used the tray to enter the gallery without attracting suspicion. They immediately searched the servants' storage room. After several minutes, Clara found the tray. It is this one. Victoria examined it. Beneath the silver edge was a tiny dark smear. Alexander brought a candle closer. There, hidden beneath the tray's rim, was a small fragment of blue velvet. The same color as the lining of the sapphire's display case. Victoria carefully removed it. This is evidence. But there was more. Inside the storage cupboard, they discovered a discarded pair of black gloves. One glove contained a tiny blue thread. Alexander stared at it. The same velvet. Victoria nodded. We finally have something that connects the theft to someone outside Clara. Yet she knew the evidence was not enough. Lady Margaret could still claim that someone had planted it. They needed the final piece. The next morning, Thomas secretly approached Victoria. Your Grace. She turned. What is it? I remembered something. What? The man I saw yesterday. Victoria waited. He wasn't alone. Alexander stepped closer. Who was with him? Thomas lowered his voice. Lady Margaret. Victoria's heart sank. Are you certain? I saw them together near the west staircase. She gave him something. What? A key. Everything suddenly became clear. The missing sapphire had not been stolen by chance. It had been planned. And Clara had been chosen as the scapegoat because everyone assumed a servant would be easy to blame. Victoria looked toward Alexander. We will confront her. Alexander nodded. But not privately. Victoria's expression hardened. No. Publicly. She thought of Clara kneeling on the marble floor while the aristocrats watched. Tomorrow, those same people would witness the truth. Victoria would not simply clear her maid's name. She would expose everyone who had helped destroy it. And for the first time since the sapphire disappeared, Lady Margaret Blackwood had something to fear. The following evening, Ravenshaw Manor once again filled with the sound of music, conversation, and the rustle of expensive silk. The same aristocrats who had gathered the night before had returned for dinner. But the atmosphere was different. Everyone had heard the rumors. The sapphire was still missing. Clara Bennett was still under suspicion. And Duchess Victoria Ravenshaw had promised to uncover the truth. Lady Margaret Blackwood arrived wearing an elaborate midnight blue gown decorated with silver embroidery. Her expression was calm, almost triumphant. She believed Victoria had made a terrible mistake by challenging her publicly. After all, Margaret had spent decades building her reputation among England's most powerful families. A young duchess could not simply destroy it with accusations. Or so she believed. At precisely 8 o'clock, the ballroom doors opened. Every conversation stopped. Duchess Victoria entered. She wore a magnificent emerald green silk gown, her chestnut hair arranged in an elegant Victorian updo. At her side walked Duke Alexander Ravenshaw, 34, dressed in a black formal frock coat with a white cravat. But it was the person walking behind them who caused the greatest reaction. Clara. The young maid wore a simple ivory dress with a dark blue ribbon at the waist. She looked nervous, but Victoria had insisted that she enter the room beside her. Whispers immediately spread through the ballroom. Why is the maid here? Has she confessed? Perhaps the Duchess is going to dismiss her. Lady Margaret smiled. Your Grace, she said loudly, I assume you have finally reached a conclusion. Victoria looked directly at her. I have. Margaret's smile widened. Then perhaps we can put this unfortunate business behind us. No, Victoria said calmly. We are only beginning. The smile vanished from Margaret's face. Victoria stepped into the centre of the room. Yesterday, Clara Bennett was accused of stealing the Ravenshaw sapphire. She was publicly humiliated and forced to kneel despite repeatedly declaring her innocence. Clara lowered her eyes. Victoria continued. Tonight, I will explain exactly what happened. Margaret immediately interrupted. This is unnecessary. Victoria turned toward her. You may find it unnecessary, Lady Margaret. Clara does not. The room fell silent. Alexander stepped forward carrying a small wooden box. Victoria opened it. Inside were several pieces of evidence. First, she said, we discovered that Clara never entered the display room. She called Thomas Reed forward. The young footman stood trembling before the assembled nobles. Tell them what you saw. Thomas swallowed. I saw Clara walking toward the east drawing room shortly before the sapphire disappeared. She never entered the display room. Margaret scoffed. An unreliable servant's testimony proves nothing. Victoria nodded. Perhaps not by itself. She lifted the blue velvet fragment. This was found beneath a serving tray that was given to Clara by Lady Margaret's secretary. Margaret's eyes widened. Victoria continued. The fragment matches the lining of the sapphire's display case. A murmur moved through the crowd. Margaret stepped forward. You are suggesting that my secretary stole the jewel. I am suggesting that the evidence points toward him. You have no proof. Victoria looked at Alexander. The Duke nodded. The ballroom doors opened. 2 guards entered escorting a pale, frightened man. It was Margaret's secretary. Margaret's face went completely white. What is the meaning of this? Victoria answered. He has confessed. The secretary's lips trembled. Lady Margaret gave me the key, he whispered. A stunned silence followed. Margaret stared at him. You liar. I saw you, Thomas said suddenly. You gave him the key near the west staircase. Margaret turned toward him. You insolent little. Enough. Alexander's voice thundered across the room. Everyone fell silent. The Duke stepped forward. The secretary has admitted that he entered the display room using the key provided by Lady Margaret. He removed the sapphire and hid it inside a locked cabinet in the west wing. A guard placed the missing sapphire on a velvet cushion. Gasps erupted throughout the ballroom. The priceless blue jewel sparkled beneath the chandelier. Lady Margaret stared at it as though she had never seen it before. Victoria turned toward her. Do you still believe Clara is guilty? Margaret's face hardened. This proves nothing about my involvement. Victoria nodded. I expected you to say that. She opened the wooden box again. Inside was a folded document. This is a copy of the financial agreement you secretly arranged with several creditors. Margaret's expression changed. Victoria continued. You intended to create a scandal around the Ravenshaw household, damage my reputation, and then use the resulting instability to challenge our control of the family inheritance. Margaret's voice became quiet. You have no right. I have every right. Victoria stepped closer. You tried to destroy an innocent young woman because you believed nobody would defend her. Margaret looked toward Clara. You are nothing but a servant. The ballroom became completely silent. Clara flinched. Victoria moved between them. No. Her voice was calm. She is a human being. Margaret laughed bitterly. And you would risk your reputation for a maid. Victoria looked around the room. Yes. Several guests exchanged embarrassed glances. Victoria took Clara's hand. I would risk far more than my reputation. She looked directly at the nobles who had watched Clara kneel the previous night. I would rather lose every title I possess than remain silent while an innocent person is destroyed simply because she has less power than I do. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Victoria continued. Yesterday, Clara was forced to kneel because people believed her position made her unworthy of dignity. She paused. Tonight, I ask all of you to remember that dignity does not belong exclusively to the wealthy. No one spoke. Even the most arrogant nobles lowered their eyes. Then Alexander stepped forward. As Duke of Ravenshaw, I fully support the Duchess's decision. He turned toward the gathered guests. Lady Margaret will no longer be permitted to interfere in the affairs of this household. Margaret looked around desperately. No one came to her defense. Her influence had disappeared in a matter of minutes. The guards escorted her and her secretary from the ballroom. When the doors closed behind them, silence remained. Then Victoria turned toward Clara. She reached into a small velvet case and removed a delicate gold pendant. This belonged to my mother. Clara shook her head. Your Grace, I cannot accept. You can. Victoria placed the pendant around Clara's neck. You served this household with loyalty when you had every reason to leave it. Clara began to cry. I only did what I was supposed to do. No, Victoria said gently. You did more than that. She embraced her. The gesture shocked many of the aristocrats in the room. A duchess embracing her maid was something few of them had ever witnessed. But Victoria did not care. She had made her choice. The next morning, Clara received a formal written apology from the household, along with a generous sum that would secure her future. Victoria also established new rules at Ravenshaw Manor. No servant could be publicly punished without evidence. No accusation could be treated as guilt. And no person, regardless of rank, would be allowed to use their position to humiliate another human being. Months later, the story of what happened at Ravenshaw Manor had spread throughout the county. Some aristocrats criticized Victoria. Others quietly admired her. But among the servants, her name was spoken with something more meaningful than admiration. It was spoken with trust. One evening, Victoria stood on the manor balcony watching the sunset. Clara approached her. Your Grace. Victoria turned. Yes. Thank you. Victoria smiled. You do not need to thank me. Clara touched the pendant around her neck. You gave me my dignity back. Victoria looked toward the glowing horizon. No, Clara. She smiled softly. They tried to take it from you. And they failed. Behind them, the bells of Ravenshaw Manor began to ring. Victoria knew that the evening had changed more than Clara's life. It had changed hers as well. She had learned that true nobility was not found in a title, a fortune, or a grand estate. It was found in the courage to stand beside someone when the entire world expected you to walk away. And from that day forward, the people of Ravenshaw Manor remembered the night a duchess refused to let an innocent maid kneel, and changed her entire household because of it. 3 months had passed since the night Lady Margaret Blackwood's conspiracy had been exposed. Winter had settled over the English countryside, covering the gardens of Ravenshaw Manor with a thin layer of frost. The once bustling estate had become quieter, but something within its walls had changed forever. It was no longer simply a magnificent home belonging to one of England's most powerful families. It had become a place where people were expected to treat one another with dignity. Duchess Victoria Ravenshaw, 28, stood inside the manor's great library, reviewing a stack of papers with Duke Alexander Ravenshaw, 34. We have received another letter, Alexander said. Victoria looked up. From whom? The Charity Committee in London. He handed her the letter. They heard about the changes you made here. They want you to become their patron. Victoria smiled. Because of what happened with Clara? Because of what you did afterward? Victoria looked down at the letter. Since the scandal, several wealthy families had quietly approached her. Some admired her courage. Others simply wanted to associate themselves with the Duchess, who had become the subject of countless conversations throughout high society. But Victoria had little interest in fame. She cared about results. "I don't want people praising me," she said. "I want them to understand why I did it." Alexander smiled. "Then perhaps you should accept." Victoria looked at him. "You think so?" "I do." Before she could answer, a gentle knock came at the door. Clara Bennett entered. She was still dressed modestly, but her clothing had changed. Victoria had arranged for Clara to receive proper education and training so that she could eventually become the head of the household's domestic administration. Clara carried a folder. "Your Grace, I have finished the accounts." Victoria smiled. "Come in, Clara." Clara placed the folder on the desk. "The new servants' contracts are ready. Everyone has received written wages, working hours, and responsibilities." Alexander looked impressed. "You completed all of that yourself?" Clara smiled shyly. "With some help from Mrs. Whitby." Victoria looked proudly at her. "You have done wonderfully." Clara's expression softened. "There was a time when I thought I would never be able to look anyone in the eye again." Victoria knew exactly what she meant. The night Clara had been forced to kneel remained vivid in both their memories. Victoria walked toward the window. "People can make you feel small," she said quietly, "but they cannot decide your worth." Clara nodded. "I remember what you told me that night." "What did I say?" "That my position did not make me less human." Victoria turned toward her. "And you finally believe it?" Clara smiled. "Yes." That answer meant more to Victoria than any praise she had received from the aristocracy. Later that afternoon, Victoria and Clara walked through the estate gardens. Several servants were working nearby. When they saw the Duchess approaching, they bowed respectfully. Victoria smiled and greeted them by name. Clara watched her. "You remember everyone's names." "I try to." "You know that isn't common among people of your position." Victoria stopped walking. "Perhaps that is the problem." Clara smiled. The two women continued toward the small village school that Victoria had recently begun supporting. The school had been struggling for years. Many servants' children had never received proper education because their families could not afford it. Victoria had decided to change that. Inside the classroom, children gathered around her excitedly. One little girl approached Clara. "Miss Bennett, are you the Duchess's maid?" Clara hesitated. Before she could answer, Victoria smiled. "She is my friend." The child's eyes widened. "Can a duchess be friends with a maid?" Victoria laughed softly. "Of course." Clara looked at Victoria with emotion in her eyes. That simple sentence meant more than any title. That evening, Victoria returned to Ravenshaw Manor and found Alexander waiting in the entrance hall. "There is something you should see." He handed her a newspaper. Victoria unfolded it. The headline read, "Duchess Ravenshaw leads new movement for fair treatment of household servants." Victoria sighed. "I thought I asked them not to make this about me." Alexander laughed. "You cannot control newspapers." "I wish I could." "You would probably frighten half of London." Victoria smiled. Then her expression became serious. "Alexander, do you ever regret what happened?" He looked at her. "Which part?" "Everything. The scandal. The investigation. Losing Margaret's friendship. The rumors." Alexander shook his head. "Not for a moment." Victoria smiled. "Neither do I." He reached for her hand. "You know what surprised me most?" "What?" "That night, when everyone expected you to protect the family's reputation, you chose to protect Clara." Victoria looked toward the ballroom. "I wasn't protecting Clara instead of the family's honor." She paused. "I was protecting the family's honor by protecting Clara." Alexander smiled. "That is exactly why I married you." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "You haven't married me." Alexander laughed. "Not yet." Victoria stared at him for a moment before smiling. Outside, snow began falling softly over the estate. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy Ravenshaw Manor had instead transformed it. Lady Margaret's name gradually disappeared from respectable society. Her influence vanished, her financial scheme collapsed, and the people who had once followed her avoided even mentioning her. But Clara's story became something different. It became a story about courage. A story about a young woman who had been forced to kneel before people who believed themselves superior, and who ultimately stood taller than all of them. Years later, whenever new servants arrived at Ravenshaw Manor, they were told one particular story. They were told about the Duchess who had once walked into a ballroom and stopped an entire room from humiliating an innocent maid. And they were told the lesson Victoria had left behind. A person's worth is never determined by the clothes they wear, the work they perform, or the title written beside their name. It is determined by the heart they carry. And at Ravenshaw Manor, that lesson became part of the household forever.